They called him Little Nicky, but there was nothing little about the fear he carried. At 5'5", he was a short man in a world of giants, yet every glance, every whisper, every story about him made him grow larger than life. He ruled Philadelphia not with charm or diplomacy, but with rage sharpened into a weapon. For Nicky Scarfo, respect wasn't asked for, it was taken, and the price was blood. He was born in Brooklyn in 1929, during the Great Depression. His family moved to South Philadelphia when he was still a boy, chasing opportunity, but finding only hard streets and harder men. The neighborhood was alive with the smell of fresh bread from corner bakeries, the clang of hammers from workshops, and the sound of Italian voices spilling out of row houses. Kids played stickball in the alleys, but young Nicky didn't play for long. He fought. Teachers said he had a quick temper. Other boys learned not to joke about his size, not if they wanted to leave school without a broken nose. Even as a kid, Scarfo carried a chip on his shoulder. If he felt mocked, he didn't forget. He stored grudges like ammunition, ready to fire when the time was right. In his teenage years, he found boxing. The gyms of South Philly were small and sweaty, filled with the smell of liniment and leather. Under the single light bulbs that swung above the ring, Scarfo fought like every punch was personal. He wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but he fought with a fury that unsettled opponents. Trainers noticed his stare. It wasn't the eyes of a boy looking to win trophies, but of someone trying to settle a score with the world itself. Outside the ring, that same rage followed him. There's a story of Scarfo hurling a meat cleaver at a man during a kitchen argument. Another time, at a wedding, he broke someone's nose over a spilled drink. These weren't accidents. They were warnings. He wanted people to know he wasn't to be laughed at, not for his size, not for anything. And in the background of South Philly, he saw the men who really commanded respect. The mob. They weren't like his father, who worked with his hands, sweating for every dollar. These men wore pressed suits, shiny shoes, and carried themselves like kings of the block. They didn't shout to be heard. Their silence carried weight. Among them was his uncle, Nicholas Piccolo, a soldier in the Philadelphia family. Nicky studied him, not with admiration but with hunger. He wanted that power. By the 1950s, Scarfo had been inducted into the Philadelphia mob under Angelo Bruno, the Gentle Don. Bruno was respected, known for keeping the peace, avoiding unnecessary violence, and forbidding drug trafficking. To Scarfo, Bruno's style felt weak. He didn't believe in calm deals or diplomacy. To him, fear was stronger than friendship, and violence spoke louder than rules. Scarfo proved that in 1963, in a restaurant argument, he pulled a knife and stabbed a man to death. It wasn't sanctioned, it wasn't business, it was pure temper. The killing infuriated Bruno. To him, Scarfo was reckless, dangerous, a bomb waiting to explode. So Bruno sent him away, into exile, assigning him to Atlantic City, a place seen as punishment, a dead end. But exile didn't bury Scarfo. It planted him where the ground was about to explode with opportunity. Atlantic City in the 1960s was faded, tired. Boarded-up hotels lined the boardwalk. Neon signs flickered weakly. Tourists were scarce. Most mobsters saw it as a wasteland. Scarfo saw it as a blank canvas. He started small, loan sharking, running numbers, shaking down bar owners who had fallen behind on bills. He recruited his young cousin, Philip Crazy Phil Leonetti, teaching him the rules of fear. Scarfo didn't collect debts with warnings. He collected them with bottles smashed across faces, with men left bloodied in alleys. He made examples of people, turning every act of violence into a story that would spread faster than money ever could. Soon, the whispers began. Don't cross Nicky. Don't joke about his height. Don't test him. The city was weak, and Scarfo filled it with shadows. When New Jersey legalized casino gambling in the 1970s, Atlantic City came roaring back to life. Developers poured in, casinos rose like new monuments, and billions of dollars flowed through construction projects and unions. Scarfo was already there, already embedded. What had begun as exile became his empire. But even in success, his rage never cooled. He carried paranoia like other men carried wallets. He never sat with his back to a door, never used the same route twice, never trusted anyone fully, not even Leonetti. Associates said being near him was like standing beside a live wire. You never knew when the spark would strike, only that it eventually would. There's a chilling story from those early Atlantic City years. An associate made a joke about Scarfo's height. Days later, he disappeared. Some said he was buried in the Pine Barrens. Others whispered he was dumped in the river. No one really knew. But what mattered was that after that, no one ever joked about Scarfo's size again. Exile had transformed him. Atlantic City, once seen as a punishment, became his throne. He ruled not with wealth, not with charm, but with pure fear. And as the casinos rose, so too did his power. But the storm inside him, the anger, the suspicion, the hunger, was only growing stronger. And soon, Philadelphia itself would feel it. The story of Nicky Scarfo's rise wasn't written in boardrooms or backroom deals. It was written in blood on sidewalks, in whispers carried through neighborhoods, in the silence of men too afraid to speak his name. If exile in Atlantic City had been the spark, violence was the fuel, and Scarfo never ran out of it. One of the first real turning points came with William "Billy" Dugan. Dugan wasn't a made guy. He was Irish, a union man with connections to construction jobs along the boardwalk. He was loud, careless, and worst of all, disrespectful. He mocked Scarfo, called him little man when Scarfo wasn't around. Maybe he thought Nicky wouldn't hear about it. Maybe he thought being Irish made him untouchable in mob politics. He was wrong on both counts. Scarfo heard the whispers and burned with fury. For years, he had been laughed at for his size, for his short fuse, for his eagerness to prove himself. But now, as his reputation grew in Atlantic City, he couldn't afford to let even one insult slide. Respect was everything to him, and if it couldn't be earned, it would be forced. This time, the hit was sanctioned. For the first time, Scarfo had permission from above to handle it his way. To most men, that meant carrying out the job quickly and quietly, leaving as little noise as possible. But Scarfo didn't believe in quiet. He believed in messages. It was a cold night off Route 40 when Dugan was lured into a car under the pretense of business. He thought it was a meeting, maybe a deal, maybe a payoff. Instead, it was his funeral. Scarfo shot him point blank. No hesitation. No pause. One bullet, then another, as if to erase not just Dugan but the insult itself. The body was left in the open, dumped without care. Scarfo wanted people to find him. He wanted the city to know. Word spread fast. Stories of that night multiplied like shadows. Some said Scarfo smiled as he pulled the trigger. Others swore he lit a cigarette as the life drained out of Dugan's eyes. The details didn't matter. What mattered was the story, and Scarfo understood that better than anyone. Fear traveled faster than money, and it bought more obedience than any bribe could. From then on, collections became easier. Debtors paid before deadlines. Union men stopped asking questions. Bartenders handed envelopes over without needing reminders. The lesson was simple. Don't cross Scarfo. The man might be small, but his reach was enormous. Leonetti, still young at the time, witnessed it all. He was no longer just a cousin. He was becoming Scarfo's shadow. Scarfo taught him not only how to collect debts, but how to send a message. Don't warn a man twice, Scarfo told him. You warn him once. After that, you show him. Leonetti listened, learned, and slowly began to see the world through his uncle's eyes. Violence wasn't random for Scarfo, it was theater. Every act had an audience, whether it was one man or an entire neighborhood. When a contractor resisted mob-controlled labor, Scarfo didn't just threaten him. He torched his car and left it burning outside his house. When a bookmaker skimmed money, Scarfo didn't just demand it back. He had him strangled in a parking lot, the betting slip stuffed into his pockets as a warning. These weren't just punishments, they were performances. Each one said the same thing. Scarfo was watching, and Scarfo never forgave. The contrast with Angelo Bruno couldn't have been sharper. Bruno had ruled Philadelphia with quiet diplomacy, keeping violence to a minimum. To him, unnecessary killings were bad for business. But to Scarfo, there was no such thing as unnecessary violence. Every murder, every beating, every explosion of rage built his reputation, brick by bloody brick. Even in exile, Scarfo had become a name in Philadelphia again. The man they thought would fade into the shadows of a dying boardwalk was now thriving. When New Jersey legalized gambling in the 1970s, Atlantic City exploded with new casinos and billions in cash. Scarfo was already there, rooted deep in the unions, the construction jobs, the flow of money. What others scrambled to grab, he already controlled. Still, paranoia clung to him like a second skin. He trusted no one completely. Even his own nephew was tested constantly, watched, measured, weighed. Associates described him as a man who carried suspicion the way others carried rosary beads. He prayed to it, lived by it, let it guide his every decision. And the paranoia spread. His crew learned to mirror his behavior. They checked the bottoms of their cars for wires or bombs. They rotated restaurants, never sitting at the same table twice. They whispered in corners, never raising their voices. Being part of Scarfo's world meant inheriting his fear. But for all the paranoia, his empire thrived. Atlantic City was his kingdom, and he ruled it with iron fists and cold eyes. Still, he wanted more. He wanted the crown of Philadelphia, the respect denied him by Bruno and the old guard. He wanted his name spoken in the same breath as the great bosses of New York, not as a reckless soldier, but as a leader feared across state lines. He didn't need to rush. He knew time had a way of eroding even the strongest men. Bruno's refusal to allow drug trafficking had already angered younger mobsters. They wanted the fast money, the easy profits, the millions flooding in from heroin and cocaine. To them, Bruno was outdated, a relic. Scarfo, with his willingness to embrace violence and break rules, looked like the future. And then came the night when the streets of South Philadelphia exploded. March 1980. Angelo Bruno, the gentle Don, sat in the passenger seat of a car outside his home. He didn't see the shotgun barrel slide up to the window. One blast, and his reign was over. The man who had exiled Scarfo, the boss who had ruled with diplomacy for nearly 2 decades, slumped lifeless, his blood staining the upholstery. The city erupted with whispers, fear, and chaos. A power vacuum had opened, and for Scarfo, it was the moment he had been waiting for. The shotgun blast that ended Angelo Bruno's life echoed far beyond the quiet street where he fell. For nearly 2 decades, the gentle Don had kept Philadelphia's mob under control with a strange kind of diplomacy, favoring peace over blood, business over war. But on that cold March night in 1980, his face was torn apart by a single shot, and with it, the old order collapsed. News of Bruno's death spread like fire through South Philly. Men poured into cafes and bars, voices hushed but urgent. Some couldn't believe it. Others nodded knowingly, as if they'd been waiting for this moment. Ordinary people whispered about the boss who had been blown away in his own neighborhood. For them, it was proof that the mob wasn't untouchable, that even the man who seemed calmest of all could meet a violent end. For the underworld, it was an invitation to chaos. The hit had been organized by Bruno's own consigliere, Antonio Caponegro. He believed he had support from higher-ups in New York, but he was wrong. Killing a boss without commission approval was a death sentence. Weeks later, Caponegro's body was found in the trunk of a car in the Bronx, naked, battered, shot, and stuffed with dollar bills in his mouth. It was the commission's way of saying he'd been greedy, reckless, and stupid. In less than a month, Philadelphia had lost both its boss and his consigliere. The family was headless, broken, scrambling for direction. Allegiances shifted overnight. Captains met in secret. Soldiers whispered about who might rise next. No one trusted anyone, because every move could be seen as betrayal. And while the city bled confusion, down in Atlantic City, Nicky Scarfo watched quietly. He wasn't the kind of man to mourn Bruno. Bruno had banished him, had treated him like a hot-headed liability. Scarfo never forgot slights like that. Now the man who had exiled him was gone, and the punishment that once looked permanent had turned into preparation. Scarfo had an empire in Atlantic City, steady money from unions and casinos, and a reputation for ruthlessness that only grew sharper with every story told. The Commission, desperate to restore order, chose Phil Testa as the new boss. Testa was known as the Chicken Man, not for cowardice, but because of his ties to the poultry business. He wasn't flashy, but he was respected. Unlike Bruno, he saw value in Scarfo. He recognized that violence, in the right doses, could steady a family teetering on the edge. Scarfo, in turn, pledged loyalty to Testa, waiting, watching, always calculating. But order in Philadelphia was fragile, held together by nerves and temporary truces. The old code of loyalty had cracked, and everyone knew it. Men who once ate pasta together in Bruno's dining room now eyed each other like enemies. Every meeting was tense, every joke double-edged, every silence dangerous. Scarfo thrived in that environment. Suspicion was his native language. Paranoia became his closest companion. He never sat with his back to the door, never used the same entrance twice, never trusted a smile that lasted too long. Associates said he could read betrayal in the way a man lit his cigarette or shifted in his chair. It wasn't just an instinct, it was an obsession. And in those years after Bruno's death, paranoia wasn't a weakness. It was survival. Stories about his temper multiplied. One night in an Atlantic City bar, a drunk local spilled beer on Scarfo's shoes. The man apologized, swore it was an accident. Scarfo smashed a glass into his mouth, knocking out his teeth. No charges were filed. No witnesses spoke up. The silence was louder than any siren. Even his nephew, Leonetti, began to notice the change. He had always feared his uncle, but now the fear deepened. Scarfo no longer seemed like a man. It was as if he'd become a storm in human form, unpredictable, relentless, impossible to escape. Leonetti followed orders without question, but he also began to see the cracks. The way Scarfo's rage frightened allies as much as enemies, the way suspicion turned friends into targets. Still, Scarfo's position grew stronger. Atlantic City was booming, billions of dollars pouring into casinos, construction, and unions. Every project had Scarfo's fingerprints on it. He squeezed contractors, skimmed profits, and demanded cuts from anyone who wanted a piece of the action. Money was his oxygen, but fear was his heartbeat. By 1981, Testa's reign ended in blood. A homemade nail bomb ripped through his porch, killing him instantly. Neighbors found pieces of his body scattered across the steps. They called him the Chicken Man, and now the nickname became grotesque irony, his feathers blown across South Philly in a spray of flesh and bone. The city panicked again. Another boss dead, this time by bomb, not bullet. The Mafia had rules, but Philadelphia's mob seemed determined to break them all. Car bombs, shotgun blasts, betrayals. What was happening on those streets was more war than family. Scarfo didn't flinch. He saw opportunity in every corpse. Each killing thinned the ranks, eliminated rivals, cleared paths. Where others scrambled, he stayed steady, building his power base, feeding his paranoia, waiting for the moment to step in. And when the commission looked at the bloody mess Philadelphia had become, they didn't see many options left. They saw Scarfo, a man small in size but terrifying in reputation, a man who had turned exile into empire, a man who demanded respect through fear. He was dangerous, unstable, and ruthless. But in a city drowning in violence, maybe that was exactly what they needed. The stage was set. Scarfo's time was coming. The man who once sat in the shadows of Atlantic City was about to take the crown of Philadelphia. And he wouldn't rule with peace or patience. He would rule with terror. The murder of Phil Testa left the Philadelphia mob leaderless once again. Two bosses dead in less than 2 years. First Bruno with a shotgun, then Testa with a nail bomb. The city buzzed with rumors, each one darker than the last. Who would dare take the throne now? Who could survive long enough to keep it? In the smoky corners of South Philly bars, men placed bets on names. Some favored veterans with steady hands. Others whispered about younger captains hungry for power. But one name, spoken in low voices, carried more fear than all the rest. Nicky Scarfo. Scarfo wasn't the obvious choice. He was short, brash, volatile, and known more for violence than business sense. But violence was exactly what Philadelphia had become. The city didn't need a diplomat. It needed a man who could terrify rivals into silence. And Scarfo was that man. The commission in New York, tired of the chaos spilling across state lines, saw him as a necessary evil. He might have been reckless, but at least he was decisive. Better a dictator than another round of explosions in the streets. In 1981, Nicky Scarfo was officially recognized as boss of the Philadelphia crime family. He didn't waste a second proving it. Scarfo moved into the role like a general stepping onto a battlefield. He called meetings with captains, laying down rules in a sharp, clipped voice. Everyone owed him tribute, no exceptions. Every dollar earned flowed upward, and he decided how much flowed back down. Anyone who resisted, anyone who questioned, was met not with warnings but with bullets. He didn't pretend to be like Bruno or Testa. He didn't want to be loved or even respected. He wanted to be feared, and fear became his currency. Scarfo's paranoia, once just a personal trait, now infected the entire organization. He installed himself in fortified apartments, kept multiple hideouts, never lingered in one spot. His men lived the same way, rotating cars, switching meeting spots, carrying guns tucked under their jackets. Life in the Philadelphia mob under Scarfo wasn't glamorous. It was survival. Yet in the chaos, Scarfo thrived. He pushed deeper into Atlantic City, locking down unions, construction jobs, and casino contracts. Developers who wanted smooth projects paid quietly. Union leaders who hesitated were beaten, threatened, or worse. Money poured in, but every dollar was stained with fear. His nephew, Phil Leonetti, became his right hand. Leonetti collected payments, delivered orders, and watched as his uncle's paranoia grew darker by the day. "Don't trust anyone," Scarfo told him. "Even family. Especially family." Leonetti nodded, but the words stayed with him, sharp as blades. Scarfo began eliminating anyone he considered a threat, even longtime allies. Salvatore "Chucky" Merlino, once one of his closest captains, fell out of favor after Scarfo convinced himself Merlino was plotting behind his back. No evidence, no proof, just suspicion. That was enough. Merlino was shot dead, another reminder that loyalty meant nothing to Scarfo's storm of paranoia. Every murder became a headline. Bodies found in parking lots, in alleys, in shallow graves in the Pine Barrens. Philadelphia turned into a city of whispers and funerals. The mob wasn't just violent, it was unstable, ruled by a man who seemed more obsessed with crushing insults than building profits. Still, for a time it worked. Men paid faster. Rivals thought twice. Even ordinary people who had never crossed Scarfo felt his presence in the air, like a storm cloud hanging low over the city. They told stories of his temper, of his height, of his obsession with respect. He became a legend of fear, the kind of man whose shadow could silence a room. But cracks began to show. Scarfo's violence wasn't surgical, it was messy, unpredictable, and often unnecessary. Killing Merlino didn't strengthen him. It terrified his own men. They started whispering in corners, wondering who would be next. Fear worked, but only for so long. When men feared their boss more than the law, betrayal became tempting. Scarfo couldn't see it. He thought paranoia protected him, but it blinded him instead. He spent hours ranting about plots that didn't exist, turning allies into enemies with nothing but suspicion. He pushed his men harder, demanded more money, more tribute, more blood. The family wasn't a family anymore. It was a dictatorship, ruled by a man whose fury never slept. And the more brutal Scarfo became, the closer the FBI moved in. Investigators had been watching Atlantic City since the casinos opened. They tracked union payoffs, monitored construction deals, and photographed Scarfo's men slipping in and out of backroom meetings. Every time Scarfo made a move, every time one of his soldiers collected an envelope or dumped a body, the FBI added another page to the growing case file. But Scarfo didn't believe in invisible enemies. He couldn't see the law the way he could see rivals, So he convinced himself it wasn't a threat. "The law don't scare me," he told Leonetti one night. "They can lock me up, but they can't kill me. The streets can kill me. That's where my eyes stay." It was a fatal mistake. Scarfo believed the throne of Philadelphia was his forever. He believed fear would hold the city in place, that bullets could silence betrayal, that paranoia was protection. For a time it worked, but behind the smoke-filled rooms and blood-stained sidewalks, the walls were closing in. The commission had given him power, but they were watching too. And the FBI was patient. They knew Scarfo wasn't just violent. He was careless. Every body he left behind, every dollar he squeezed, every order he gave was another nail in his own coffin. For now, though, Scarfo sat on his throne, small in stature, towering in violence. The man they once exiled to a dying boardwalk now ruled one of the most feared families in America. And he ruled it exactly as he had always promised, through fear, suspicion, and blood. But storms burn brightest before they burn out. And Scarfo's storm was just beginning to consume him. By the mid-1980s, Nicky Scarfo's grip on Philadelphia was absolute. Every dollar that moved through the city, from construction jobs to gambling dens, carried his shadow. His men collected envelopes with his name whispered over them like a prayer. But this wasn't respect, it was fear, and fear is a fragile kind of power. It doesn't last. It corrodes. Scarfo treated his title not as a responsibility, but as a weapon. He used it to crush anyone who questioned him, whether rival, ally, or family. His rule became a parade of funerals, each one a warning, each one a story whispered through South Philly like smoke. One of the most chilling examples was Salvatore "Chucky" Merlino. Merlino wasn't just a captain. He was Scarfo's underboss, family by marriage, tied into the heart of the organization. For years, he had carried out Scarfo's orders, collected his money, and enforced his rule. But Scarfo's paranoia couldn't leave him alone. He became convinced, without proof, that Merlino was plotting against him. In Scarfo's world, suspicion was as good as guilt. Loyalty didn't matter. History didn't matter. Blood didn't matter. He ordered Merlino killed. The man who had once been his closest ally was shot down, his body left as proof that no one was safe. For Scarfo, it was a victory. For his men, it was terror. If Chucky Merlino could be taken out, who couldn't? Leonetti watched it happen. He'd been raised under Scarfo's wing, taught to see violence as survival, taught to fear disloyalty more than death. But with Merlino's murder, doubt crept in. He began to wonder if his uncle's storm had spun beyond control. Still, he stayed silent. In Scarfo's world, silence wasn't just survival, it was oxygen. The killings piled up. Associates who hesitated, captains who looked the wrong way, soldiers who were suspected of talking to the FBI. Each one disappeared or turned up dead. Scarfo didn't need reasons. He needed examples. The more people feared him, the more he believed he was untouchable. But paranoia works both ways. His men began to fear not just Scarfo's temper, but his suspicion. They stopped speaking freely, stopped making jokes, stopped even thinking too loudly. They knew that in Scarfo's eyes, hesitation was betrayal. A pause before answering could cost you your life. Scarfo turned routine meetings into tests. He would sit at the head of the table, eyes darting from face to face, reading expressions like a lie detector. If a man shifted in his chair, Scarfo wondered if he was plotting. If a soldier scratched his nose, Scarfo wondered if it was a signal. It wasn't leadership, it was paranoia wrapped in ritual. His violence wasn't subtle, either. He didn't care who knew. There was the Union official who disappeared after questioning Scarfo's demands. His body was later found in the Pine Barrens, a shallow grave dug into the sand. There was the bookmaker strangled in a parking lot, betting slips stuffed in his pocket as a warning. There was the contractor whose car exploded after refusing to pay tribute. Each story grew in the telling, adding to Scarfo's legend of terror. In the neighborhoods, people lived under a cloud. South Philly wasn't just a community, it was Scarfo's stage. The smell of tomato sauce from Sunday dinners mixed with the whispers of men vanishing, of women left widowed, of sons never coming home. Kids grew up hearing their fathers tell them, "Don't ever cross Little Nicky." Even in exile years earlier, he had been feared. Now, on the throne, he was untouchable. Or so it seemed. Scarfo's obsession with respect drove him harder. If someone slighted him, even with a joke, they were as good as dead. There was a chilling story of a man who called him Little Caesar in a bar. Days later, that man vanished. People swore they saw Scarfo smirk when the news spread. No one dared to laugh at him again. But all this violence came with a price. The family was shrinking, not growing. Every killing cut away at his own foundation. Men paid their tribute, yes, but they also dreamed of escape. Some began talking quietly to the FBI, desperate for protection. Others simply disappeared, slipping into hiding before Scarfo's suspicion caught them. The more he ruled through fear, the more isolated he became. Even Leonetti, the nephew who had always been by his side, began to feel the storm's weight. Scarfo tested him too, pushing him, questioning him, reminding him that family meant nothing if betrayal ever entered the room. Leonetti's silence grew heavier. He obeyed, collected money, delivered orders. But in his mind, a thought took root. If his uncle could kill Chucky Merlino, he could kill him too. Meanwhile, the FBI was watching with growing interest. They had wiretaps in bars, bugs in union offices, informants feeding them details. They knew about the killings, the extortion, the paranoia that gripped the city. Every time Scarfo's men dumped a body, the Bureau collected another piece of the puzzle. Scarfo didn't see it. He believed fear could silence everything, even the law. He believed bullets could erase betrayal, even betrayal he imagined. To him, the streets were the only battlefield that mattered. The law was just paperwork, and paperwork never scared him. But paperwork had power. It stacked up in files, in evidence boxes, in tape recordings. It built cases stronger than fear, stronger than bullets. While Scarfo ruled Philadelphia through terror, the FBI built a case that would bring the entire empire crashing down. For now, though, Scarfo still sat high on his throne. The money flowed. The bodies fell. The city whispered his name in dread. But the cracks in his empire were widening, and the walls were closing in. And in the shadows, betrayal was already waiting. By 1986, the FBI wasn't just circling Nicky Scarfo. They were inside his world. Wiretaps hummed in back rooms, bugs listened from ceilings, and informants whispered details into hidden recorders. Every meeting, every payoff, every careless word added another thread to a net that was slowly wrapping around him. But Scarfo couldn't see it. He was too busy fighting ghosts of his own making. His paranoia had reached new heights. To Scarfo, every hesitation was betrayal. Every late envelope was theft. Every whisper in the corner was a conspiracy. He no longer looked at his men as soldiers. He looked at them as suspects. The tighter he squeezed, the more they slipped through his fingers. The paranoia even reached his dinners. Scarfo never ate without first having someone else taste the food. He never drank a glass of wine unless it came sealed from a bottle he opened himself. Associates recalled watching him stare at a plate of pasta as if it were poisoned, poking at it before lifting a fork. "Everyone wants to kill me," he muttered more than once. "That's how I know I'm doing it right." But it wasn't just paranoia, it was prophecy. His violence had left bodies in alleys, rivers, and shallow graves across Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Each corpse had family, friends, or rivals who wanted revenge. Scarfo wasn't imagining enemies. He had earned them. Still, he doubled down. The more the whispers grew, the harsher his punishments became. A soldier late with tribute was beaten half to death. A Union man who stalled on a payoff was found in the trunk of a car. A captain who dared to question him was gunned down in broad daylight. Scarfo didn't just rule through fear. He ruled through spectacle. Every killing was a stage play, and the city was the audience. But fear can't keep men loyal forever. Scarfo's soldiers began to crack. Some disappeared before his suspicion reached them. Others quietly reached out to the FBI, desperate for deals, offering scraps of information to save their own lives. Every conversation Scarfo thought was secret was another piece of evidence piling up in federal offices. Leonetti, still his most trusted confidant, saw it unraveling. He had grown up in his uncle's storm, raised on the belief that fear was stronger than friendship. But now he saw the storm swallowing its own. Men weren't following Scarfo out of loyalty. They were obeying out of terror, waiting for their chance to run. Leonetti began to wonder if his uncle's obsession with respect had destroyed the very family he had fought so hard to control. Scarfo couldn't see it. Or maybe he refused to. He still strutted through Atlantic City like he owned it. He still walked into bars expecting silence, still demanded tribute as if nothing could touch him. To the outside world, he was untouchable. To those inside his circle, he was a ticking bomb. One of the most telling moments came when Scarfo accused Leonetti himself. They were alone, sitting in a back room, when Scarfo leaned forward and hissed, "Don't think I don't see the way you look at me. Don't think I don't know what's in your head. You want what I have." Leonetti froze, unsure if his uncle was about to pull a gun. Scarfo didn't. He leaned back, smirked, and muttered, "Just remember, blood don't mean a thing if it betrays me." The words cut deep. Leonetti left that room knowing something he had never dared admit before. One day, his uncle might kill him too. Meanwhile, the FBI kept tightening the noose. They leaned on low-level bookies, squeezing them for information. They cut deals with soldiers, offering protection in exchange for testimony. They gathered evidence on extortion, gambling, racketeering, and most damning of all, murder. By 1986, they weren't chasing a suspect. They were building a case to bury an empire. Scarfo's arrogance blinded him. He believed violence solved everything. If a man talked, you killed him. If a man hesitated, you killed him. If a man joked, you killed him. But killing didn't erase evidence. It created it. Each body became another nail in his coffin, another piece of proof that the FBI didn't have to search hard to find. His men felt the pressure too. The same paranoia that ruled Scarfo began to seep into them. They stopped trusting each other, stopped gathering openly, stopped laughing in bars where once they had shared stories. The family wasn't a family anymore. It was a scattered group of frightened men waiting for the storm to hit.
And it was coming fast.
In late 1986, prosecutors prepared sweeping indictments. They wanted Scarfo, Leonetti, and every major captain who had spilled blood in his name. They wanted to bring down the entire family in one strike. Behind closed doors, they stacked files thick with testimony, surveillance photos, wiretap transcripts, and recordings. The picture they painted wasn't of a boss running a business. It was of a tyrant running a slaughterhouse. But Scarfo didn't see it. He couldn't. His world was too clouded by rage and suspicion. To him, the only threats were the men at his table, not the agents in their offices. "The streets can kill me," he told Leonetti. "The law can't." It was the biggest mistake of his life. Scarfo had built his empire on fear, but fear was crumbling. His enemies weren't just across the street anymore. They were inside his crew, sitting at his table, wearing wires on their chests. The FBI didn't need to knock down his walls. His own men were carrying the bricks to them. The storm he had carried since childhood was reaching its peak. And this time, it wasn't just his enemies who were in danger, it was Scarfo himself. By 1987, Nicky Scarfo sat on the throne of Philadelphia like a king in a crumbling castle. On the surface, his power seemed absolute. His men still carried envelopes into smoky back rooms. Union bosses still nodded when his name was spoken. Casino contractors still set aside cuts for the little guy who ran the city. But beneath the surface, the foundations were splitting. Fear, the thing that had built his empire, was starting to eat it alive. Scarfo had always been suspicious, but now his paranoia reached a fever pitch. He no longer trusted anyone. Not his captains, not his soldiers, not even his own blood. He watched faces like a hawk, searching for betrayal in every glance. A pause before answering a question, a nervous laugh, a drink held too long in hand. Scarfo could turn any of it into a death sentence. He no longer asked questions, he gave accusations. If a man delivered tribute late, Scarfo decided he'd skimmed. If a soldier spoke to a stranger, Scarfo assumed it was the FBI. He didn't wait for proof. In Scarfo's mind, suspicion was guilt, and guilt was punishable by death. One of the clearest examples came with Salvatore "Chucky" Merlino's murder. Merlino had been close, underboss, ally, family through marriage. But Scarfo convinced himself Merlino was plotting against him. No one else saw evidence of it, but that didn't matter. Scarfo ordered the hit. When the bullets dropped Merlino, every man in the crew got the message. If he could kill Chucky, he could kill any of them. That murder sent shockwaves through the ranks. Men who once stood proudly by Scarfo's side began whispering in corners, wondering when it would be their turn. Some fled, slipping into hiding. Others kept their heads down, hoping silence could protect them. A few made secret calls to the FBI, ready to trade loyalty for survival. The FBI didn't need to push hard. Scarfo's reign of terror had already done the work for them. Associates came forward with stories of murders, extortions, and meetings. Low-level soldiers confessed to avoid prison time. Even civilians, bartenders, contractors, bookmakers started talking. The picture that formed was damning. A boss who ruled not with cunning but with rage. A family collapsing under his paranoia. Scarfo didn't believe it. He still strutted through Atlantic City, his small frame cutting through casino lobbies with the confidence of a giant. He still barked orders in bars, still demanded envelopes, still warned Leonetti that the only thing that keeps men loyal is fear. To him, the law was paperwork, and paperwork couldn't kill him. "The streets can kill me," he told Leonetti again and again. "The law can't." But the law wasn't just paperwork anymore. It was wiretaps, sealed indictments, cooperating witnesses. It was pages upon pages of evidence, each one connecting Scarfo to violence, each one cutting away at the myth of invincibility he carried. Inside his circle, betrayal brewed. Leonetti, once his shadow, once his student in fear, began to feel the weight of his uncle's suspicion. He noticed how Scarfo's eyes lingered too long on him during meetings, how Scarfo's voice hardened when he spoke, how Scarfo repeated that line, "Blood don't mean a thing if it betrays me." The words stuck like glass in Leonetti's mind. He had followed Scarfo his entire life, carried out his orders, enforced his will. But now he wondered if loyalty meant anything at all. If Scarfo could kill Merlino, what stopped him from killing his own nephew? The thought didn't leave Leonetti. Not when he sat at Scarfo's table, not when he carried envelopes, not even when he lay awake at night. The city felt it too. In South Philly, families whispered about the madness at the top. They still feared Scarfo, but they also pitted his men. Everyone knew the truth. It wasn't the FBI they needed to fear most. It was Scarfo himself. Meanwhile, prosecutors prepared for war. They stacked indictments on top of each other. Racketeering, extortion, gambling, union corruption, and murder. They weren't building a case against one man. They were building a case against an entire empire. They wanted Scarfo, yes, but they wanted his captains, his soldiers, his structure. They wanted to burn Philadelphia's mob to the ground. The timing couldn't have been worse for Scarfo. He was already drowning in suspicion, already killing allies, already losing the loyalty of men he needed most. The FBI didn't have to tear down his family. He was tearing it down himself. But Scarfo still believed in fear. He thought as long as people trembled at his name, he was untouchable. He thought bullets and threats could silence betrayal. What he didn't see was that fear has an expiration date. Too much of it, and men stop fearing you. They start hating you. And hate finds a way out. By late 1987, the FBI was ready to move. The files were thick, the witnesses lined up, the evidence airtight. Scarfo didn't know it, but his storm was about to collapse. And the first crack would come from inside his own blood. By 1987, the FBI didn't need to guess what Nicky Scarfo was doing. They knew. Wiretaps crackled with his orders, bugs recorded his rants, informants painted detailed maps of his empire. They had the meetings, the murders, the shakedowns, all written down like chapters in a book. Every page told the same story. Scarfo ruled with paranoia and violence, and it was only a matter of time before it caught up to him.
But Scarfo didn't see it that way.
In his mind, the only threats that mattered came from across the table, not across the courtroom. He paced rooms like a caged animal, veins standing out in his neck, as he accused his men of plotting. To him, the streets could kill him. The law? The law was paperwork, and paperwork couldn't pull a trigger. The problem was that Scarfo had created enemies everywhere. He had killed allies, silenced rivals, and pushed his soldiers to the breaking point. His family wasn't a family anymore. It was a group of frightened men, each one wondering if they'd be next. And fear, the thing that had built his empire, was starting to tear it apart. One of the breaking points came with the murder of Salvatore, Chucky Merlino. Scarfo had convinced himself Merlino was plotting against him. There was no proof, only suspicion. But suspicion was enough. The order went out, and Merlino was gunned down. The killing sent shockwaves through the ranks. If Scarfo could kill his underboss, his relative by marriage, what protection did anyone have? Men began to whisper, not about how to serve Scarfo, but about how to survive him. Some disappeared, slipping into hiding before suspicion reached them. Others reached out to the FBI, offering information in exchange for safety. Every betrayal fueled Scarfo's paranoia, and every paranoid outburst fueled more betrayal. It was a spiral he couldn't escape. Leonetti saw it firsthand. He had grown up in his uncle's shadow, raised to believe fear was the only language men respected. But now he watched as that language turned toxic. Scarfo no longer saw loyalty. He only saw potential traitors. Leonetti knew the truth. If his uncle could kill Merlino, he could kill him too. The thought haunted him, a seed of betrayal taking root in his own heart. The FBI, meanwhile, pressed harder. They squeezed low-level associates, flipping them one by one. They leaned on contractors, on bookmakers, on union men who had once stuffed envelopes into Scarfo's hands. Each man gave a piece of the puzzle, and soon the Bureau had the whole picture. Scarfo's empire wasn't untouchable. It was fragile, built on violence and suspicion, and ready to collapse. Scarfo couldn't see it. He still carried himself like a giant. He walked into bars expecting silence, demanded tribute with the same sharp voice, and ranted to Leonetti that fear was the only glue that held men together. "They'll never take me down," he told him one night. "You know why? Because if they do, they'll have to take the whole city with me." But the truth was already written. The FBI had indictments drafted, charges stacked high: racketeering, extortion, illegal gambling, and murder. They weren't just coming for Scarfo. They were coming for his entire circle. Inside the family, paranoia reached a boiling point. Scarfo accused his captains of stealing, his soldiers of talking, even Leonetti of wanting the throne. One night, he leaned across a table, eyes burning, and said, "Blood don't mean a thing if it betrays me." Leonetti nodded, but inside, he knew what it meant. One day, it could be him on the receiving end of a bullet. The fear spread like smoke. Associates avoided meetings, skipped phone calls, disappeared without explanation. The family shrank, not from police raids, but from men abandoning the cause. Scarfo had wanted to rule with fear, but fear had become a poison. Instead of loyalty, it gave him silence. Instead of respect, it gave him distance. And in the silence, the FBI moved closer. Every wiretap, every testimony, every photograph was another step toward the inevitable. Scarfo thought fear made him invincible. What he didn't see was that fear had turned his empire into glass. It looked strong. It looked sharp. But one crack was all it took to shatter. That crack had already begun. His enemies weren't just in the FBI. They were in his own crew, sitting at his own table, waiting for the moment to save themselves. Scarfo's storm had carried him this far, but now it was eating him alive. And when it broke, it wouldn't just destroy him. It would bring down everything he had built. The sun had barely risen when the knock came. At first it sounded ordinary, like a delivery or a neighbor. But the pounding grew harder, heavier, until the walls shook. By the time Nicky Scarfo opened the door of his Atlantic City hideout, rifles were pointed at his chest. FBI agents swarmed inside, their voices sharp and cold. Scarfo didn't flinch. For years, he had lived with the idea that someone was always waiting outside with a gun. He thought it might be a rival, maybe even one of his own captains.
But it wasn't the streets this time. It was the law.
They shoved him to the floor, cuffed his wrists, read him his rights. For the first time in his life, the man who had made an entire city tremble was face down on the carpet, veins bulging as he screamed, "You can't touch me. You hear me? You can't touch me." But they already had. Across Philadelphia and Atlantic City, agents struck at once. Dozens of arrests, captains dragged out of homes, soldiers pressed against cars, bookmakers shoved into vans. The indictments were thick: racketeering, extortion, gambling, union corruption, and murder. The Bureau hadn't come for one man. They had come for an entire empire. For Scarfo, prison was supposed to be temporary. He carried himself into the courtroom like a boss still in control, smirking at prosecutors, glaring at witnesses. When a bookmaker testified that Scarfo had once beaten him in public, Scarfo leaned toward his lawyer and whispered loud enough for jurors to hear, "He should have paid me." He thought fear would follow him even into court. But in the courtroom, fear didn't matter. Witness after witness walked in, men who had once kissed his hand now pointing fingers at him. Contractors described envelopes passed in smoky rooms. Union men detailed threats delivered with guns on the table. Associates described murders planned in whispers and carried out in alleys. Even his own soldiers testified, some with trembling hands, others with relief in their eyes. The stories that had once built Scarfo's legend now destroyed him. Each killing, each outburst of rage, each paranoid suspicion was another nail in his coffin. And in the middle of it sat Phil Leonetti. Leonetti had lived his whole life in Scarfo's storm. He had carried out orders, collected debts, watched men die at his uncle's command. But now, staring at the mountain of evidence, he realized the truth. Scarfo wasn't untouchable. Scarfo was finished. And if Leonetti stayed loyal, he would be finished too. It wasn't just prison time hanging over his head. It was Scarfo's suspicion. Leonetti remembered the words, "Blood don't mean a thing if it betrays me." He knew that if Scarfo ever walked out of prison, his own life might not last a week. The FBI sensed his doubt. They offered him a way out. Protection, a lighter sentence, even freedom if he talked. At first, Leonetti resisted. Loyalty had been drilled into him since childhood. But loyalty meant nothing to Scarfo, not anymore. He had killed Chucky Merlino, his underboss and relative by marriage. He had accused Leonetti himself of wanting the throne. If Scarfo could kill them, he could kill anyone. The decision came quietly. Leonetti sat down with prosecutors and started talking. And once he began, he didn't stop. He told them about the murders, the meetings, the paranoia. He described Scarfo's rants, the way he never trusted anyone, the way he demanded fear over respect. He mapped out the family from top to bottom, naming names, dates, locations. What the FBI had built piece by piece, Leonetti filled in completely. For Scarfo, it was the ultimate betrayal. Word spread fast. In prison, Scarfo erupted. He punched walls, shouted curses, swore revenge. He told anyone who would listen that Leonetti was dead to him. But the damage was already done. With Leonetti's testimony, prosecutors had everything they needed. The trial became a parade of evidence. Photos of victims, charts of money flows, tape recordings of men talking about hits. The jury didn't take long. In 1988, Nicky Scarfo was convicted on multiple counts of racketeering, extortion, and murder. The judge handed him 55 years in federal prison, a sentence that meant he would die behind bars. He left the courtroom still cursing, still spitting at prosecutors, still acting like a boss. But the truth was clear. The most violent man in Philadelphia's mob history was finished. In South Philly, the news rippled through the neighborhoods. Some people cheered quietly, relieved that the bloodshed might finally end. Others shrugged, knowing that another boss would rise sooner or later. But everyone understood one thing. Scarfo had ruled with fear, and in the end, fear had destroyed him. Leonetti disappeared into witness protection, his testimony sealing the fate of his uncle's empire. To some, he was a traitor. To others, he was the only one smart enough to escape. He carried both labels, along with the memories of the storm that had shaped his life. Scarfo adjusted poorly to prison. He barked at guards, tried to order around fellow inmates, demanded respect from men who didn't care who he had been on the streets. His paranoia followed him into the cell block. He accused other inmates of spying, guards of poisoning his food, lawyers of selling him out. He was still Little Nicky, still raging, still convinced he was untouchable. But behind bars, rage didn't matter. He was just another number in a jumpsuit. The storm he had carried since childhood was still inside him, but now it had nowhere to go. And yet, even from his cell, his shadow lingered. Families of victims still grieved. Old associates still looked over their shoulders. The city still bore scars. Scarfo was gone, but the fear he had planted lived on. Prison walls have a way of shrinking men. Some adapt, fading quietly into the rhythm of cement and steel. Others break, swallowed by the silence. But Nicky Scarfo wasn't like other men. Even behind bars, he carried himself like the boss he had once been. He barked at guards, demanded respect from fellow inmates, strutted through the yard as if he still ruled South Philadelphia. But the truth was different. Outside those walls, his empire was gone. His captains were either dead, locked up, or in hiding. His soldiers had scattered, some under witness protection, others turning their backs on the life. The Philadelphia mob, once roaring with gunfire and ambition, was now fractured, a shadow of itself. And the man who had ruled it with fear was just another prisoner, stripped of power, locked in a cage he couldn't escape. Still, Scarfo clung to the storm inside him. He ranted about betrayal, cursed Leonetti's name, spat at the thought of men who had testified against him. To him, they were cowards, rats, traitors. He refused to admit defeat, refused to show regret. Every outburst, every glare, every smirk carried the same message. He might be in chains, but he was still Nicky Scarfo. Time, though, is stronger than rage. The years dragged on, and Scarfo's body began to fail him. The man who had once hurled meat cleavers in kitchens and strutted into casinos now shuffled slowly down prison corridors. His frame shrank, his hair thinned, his breath grew short. But even as his body weakened, his pride remained untouched. If asked about the killings, he shrugged. If asked about the fear he spread, he smiled. "That's how you survive," he said once. Fear keeps men in line. Outside, the world moved on. Philadelphia healed slowly. The blood-soaked years of Scarfo's reign became memories, whispered in bars and remembered in newspaper clippings. Kids who had grown up hearing his name now raised their own children in quieter streets. But the scars were still there, in the families who lost sons, in the women left widowed, in the silence of neighborhoods that had once lived under his shadow. His nephew, Phil Leonetti, built a new life under witness protection. From time to time, he spoke about his uncle. Not with love, not even with hatred, just with clarity. He didn't want respect, Leonetti said in one interview. He wanted fear. And in the end, that's all he had. Those words cut deeper than any bullet. They defined Scarfo's life in a single line. By the early 2000s, Scarfo's health was failing fast. He spent his last years in a federal medical prison, a shell of the man who once made Philadelphia tremble. His body gave out, but his pride didn't. He never apologized, never admitted weakness, never showed remorse. To the very end, he believed he had lived the right way, by fear. On January 13, 2017, Nicky Scarfo died in prison of heart disease. He was 87 years old. No bullets, no car bombs, no betrayals in the night, just an old man's body finally surrendering. For a man who had lived by violence, the quiet of his death was almost ironic. The news made headlines, but there were no grand funerals, no processions of men in black suits, no neighborhoods shutting down to honor him. For many, his death was simply the closing of a bloody chapter. Some families of victims felt relief. A weight lifted at last. Others said it didn't matter. He had been gone long before his heart stopped beating. And yet, his legacy remained. Nicky Scarfo wasn't remembered as a strategist or a businessman. He wasn't remembered for building wealth or strengthening the mob. He was remembered for blood, for paranoia, for turning Philadelphia into one of the most violent mafia cities in America. He was remembered as the boss who ruled not through loyalty, but through fear, and who was ultimately destroyed by it. The cell he left behind was cleared out, the walls bare, the cot stripped. Nothing remained of the man who once demanded respect with bullets. Just silence. Silence in the place where his storm finally burned itself out. But stories have a way of living longer than men. In bars, old-timers still tell them. The short boss with the burning temper, the man who stabbed over insults, the uncle who killed family, the tyrant who mistook fear for loyalty. His story became a warning in the underworld. Violence can build an empire, but paranoia will destroy it. And so, little Nicky Scarfo, 5'5" but towering in violence, lives on in memory. Not as a legend to admire, but as a cautionary tale. A reminder that in the world of gangsters, fear is sharp, but it cuts both ways.